you're gonna love it. You get to delegate so many different people, right? Like those are, I was just doing video and graphics. They had a person do audit, and they had a person do releases, and they had, but that's what we're, I mean, the video editor runs the production. That's what, right, so it's also a, when you look at how subcommittees see, they put more bills, more releases, more content than most whole committees would put out. But you need people like who are just focused on health or just focused on finance. We're blessed and cursed at the same time to have zero, I believe. I'm really excited. We hope that some people go into everyone else, but we go back and forth. It'll be 11. It'll be just shy of 11. So not terrible. I would have liked a little longer, but the youngest is like in that kind of locked down more than in my previous time. That would be nice.
So that's my secretary, will be keeping like a book portfolio, but
also taking on some more of the website stuff. So very similar to what I did here, really, which is Lauren and I just kind of split it all down the middle, and we both work on everything, and you start when you finish, you start working, and just bring it on. There's just two people, as you struggle to keep up sometimes with everything we're doing. Especially for this year. There's usually 12 people.
Yeah.
But that's small.
Yeah.
And that's especially small for me coming from, the majority was 74. Yeah. So like it's just too much. It's 5 seats in Rayburn and 3 seats in Ford. Yeah. So because it's just so huge, right? Like there's no crossover between think we met a few times in the past on one house, but,
The hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on strengthening our fiscal toolkit, policy options to improve economic resiliency. I want to welcome our witnesses here with us today. This morning we will be hearing from Dr. Doug Elmendorf, Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, and of course, former Director of the Congressional Budget Office. We have two of those here today. Dr. Olubenga Aljawhari, the Senior Economist at the Center for American Progress. Mr. John Hicks, Executive Director at the National Association of State Budget Officers, and Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, President of the American Action Forum, and again, a former CBO Director. We look forward to your testimony. I will now yield myself 5 minutes for my opening statement. Over the last 10 years, our nation has experienced the longest uninterrupted period of economic expansion in U.S. history. However, we can't afford to take it for granted. We know that business cycles are real and eventually periods of economic expansion come to an end. Of course, no one hopes for a downturn, and no one can know when one will hit, how long it will last, or which sectors or families will be impacted the most. As members of Congress, it is a responsibility of ours to make sure the federal government is ready to respond to a crisis before we are in one. Today, our expert witnesses will discuss policies that we can implement now to ensure a more secure future for our nation and our families tomorrow. As we all know, recessions damage our nation's fiscal health, put stress on local and state budgets, and most importantly, are also costly and painful for American families. When the Great Recession hit, Americans across the country, regardless of background, education, career, or state of residence, felt its effects. Many families faced bankruptcies. Others were forced to make tough choices as they watched their savings shrink, their debt grow, and their opportunities diminish. In 2009, Congress passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, increasing government investment, cutting taxes for working families and small businesses, and preventing bigger unemployment spikes. While the Recovery Act was critical, we could have and should have done more to prevent families from being left behind. The impact of the Great Recession is still being felt in communities across our country. The bottom 50% of households have only just now, more than a decade later, recovered the wealth they had in 2007. Millennials, many of whom graduated college only to enter into the worst job market in a generation, have been saddled with high student loan debt, lower earnings, and less wealth than generations before them, and they face increased barriers to economic opportunity. We see the legacy of the Great Recession in rising economic inequality and families still struggling to regain their footing. The American people expect and deserve a government that can utilize every tool needed to stabilize our economy and to soften the impact of recessions on our families. Our current economic automatic stabilizers, revenues that fall and spending that grows when the economy falters, are vital. They provide timely and targeted support during economic downturns and turn on and off when needed. When the economy is weak, working families rely even more on programs like Medicaid, SNAP, and unemployment insurance to help them meet their basic human needs. At the same time, payroll taxes and income tax withholding adjust to reflect what families are earning, and they are temporary. When the economy gains strength, fewer people rely on these programs, so spending falls. But the automatic stabilizers in current law can only do so much. Waiting for Congress to act to provide additional help in a time of crisis slows down response time, making it harder to target relief when and where it is needed most. It is time for us to consider new approaches. This is particularly important because while the next economic downturn comes, whenever that may be, it may not be as severe as the Great Recession. It may be more challenging to overcome. Interest rates today are significantly lower than they were before the last downturn, so we won't be able to rely on the Federal Reserve to play as large a role. While the world is moving at 100 miles an hour, Congress at its optimum efficiency moves at about 10 miles an hour. That's why it's crucial that we start the process of strengthening these programs now before we hit a downturn. Families and communities should receive the support they need when they need it, not months later after the damage is done. Unfortunately, the Trump administration is pursuing policies that will put more families in jeopardy when we face the next economic downturn. Changes to critical programs such as implementing untested work requirements, making it harder to access SNAP benefits, and proposing changes to how the federal government measures poverty in a way that could cut or eliminate vital assistance for millions in need. that will make programs less responsive to a slowing economy. If we want to minimize the damage caused by recessions, Congress must focus on strengthening the key programs families will rely on most. While we can't predict when or if a recession might hit or how severe its impacts will be, it is our responsibility to ensure our government has all the tools it needs to respond when necessary. We cannot afford to leave our nation and our families unprotected. I look forward to hearing testimony from our witnesses on what Congress can do to best secure our fiscal future. Now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Arkansas, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and my thanks to the gentleman seated before us. Our witnesses on the panel today look forward to your questions or to your answers to our questions. Whether some would like to admit it or not, there's been a resurgence of economic confidence within our country. Years of stagnation have been replaced with job and wage growth, as well as a prosperous American economy. The pro-growth policies our Republican majority enacted last Congress, including historic tax relief, unlocked extraordinary promise and opportunity for hardworking Americans. In fact, earlier this month, we saw a jobs report indicating the lowest unemployment rate for our nation has seen in a half century, 3.5%. Since November of 16, employers have created nearly 6.5 million new jobs across all sectors. Wages are also rising and showing sustainable organic growth. The median average income increased by 3.4% in 2018, according to the latest data from the Census Bureau. This historic forward momentum certainly does not mean that we should ignore the possibility of an economic downturn. Rather, I believe it means we should be focused on policies that ensure continued economic strength. We should encourage an environment that supports America's job creators and allows workers to pursue greater opportunities. There are a number of actions Congress can take to guard against a recession and to help maintain our current economic growth. First and foremost, the House should take up and pass the USMCA. This important trade deal will provide much-needed support for our nation's farmers and manufacturers, and it will modernize our policies to reflect the realities of a 21st century global economy. Secondly, we must protect the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which has benefited American families. This point was reiterated earlier this year as the CBO testified before our committee. The statement was clear: repealing these important reforms would reverse the gains made and put nearly 1 million American jobs at risk. Those jobs represent real families who could lose their livelihoods if these tax cuts were eliminated. Third, we must continue to reduce burdensome regulatory barriers to economic growth. Redundant federal regulations and permitting requirements unnecessarily extend the timeliness or the timelines of major projects and add massive compliance costs to development budgets. One of our witnesses today will detail the enormous cost of complying with burdensome regulations imposed by the Obama administration, $890 billion, according to the agencies themselves. The relief from these mandates over the last 2 years has been an important component of the confidence we've seen in the economy among job creators. Lastly, this Congress has a responsibility to reduce the cost of living for America's middle class. Over the past few decades, families have seen their largest price increases in some of the most heavily regulated and subsidized sectors of the economy, including healthcare, higher education, and housing. Free market policies could help lower these costs in these industries by increasing competition and enhancing consumer choice. As ranking member of this committee, I'm skeptical of proposals to create more automatic stabilizers beyond those that exist in current law. By creating more of these mechanisms, we would reduce oversight by elected officials at a time when our nation and our budget need the exact opposite. The root cause of our ever-growing debt is runaway mandatory spending, which currently accounts for about 70% of all federal spending. We should be working to bring more of those expenditures back under our oversight, which is, in my opinion, where they belong. A final reason to be suspicious of proposals to create new automatic stabilizers is that these programs are not likely to be deficit neutral. I'll be curious to see if offsets will be suggested today for any new increases in mandatory spending. Our focus should be on preventing a future crisis instead of just trying to react to one. We should implement policies that will help avoid a recession in the first place and reduce our long-term debt burden over time in a very responsible way. So again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to have this hearing today, and I look forward to the witnesses, and I yield back my time.
I thank the ranking member for his opening statement. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, you may submit those statements in writing for the record. Once again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will each have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. Dr. Elmendorf, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee. It is wonderful to be back in a place where I spent so many good hours as Director of the Congressional Budget Office and to be looking up at portraits of the two chairmen whom I served. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. I do not think a recession is imminent for the U.S. economy, but clearly the economy has slowed a great deal over the past year, and economic forecasters surveyed by the Wall Street Journal now see the probability of a recession over the next 12 months at about 1/3, compared with about 1/5 a year ago. Predicting recessions is quite difficult, and we should not count on economists to correctly anticipate the timing of the next one. But as you said, Mr. Chairman, we know there will be a next one, and we should be ready for it, and I'm pleased that the committee has convened this hearing. I want to make 3 points about using fiscal policy to fight the next recession. First, vigorous use of countercyclical tax and spending policies will be crucially important for limiting the severity of the next recession. When the economy goes into recession, the Federal Reserve will presumably cut the federal funds rate to near zero, as it did in the last recession. But because interest rates are so low already, the Fed will have less room to cut than it had before. The Fed will try to compensate through quantitative easing and forward guidance. On balance, though, I expect the Federal Reserve will be able to provide less stimulus than it has in past recessions. That will leave more for fiscal policy to do. Suppose that when the economy goes into the next recession, Congress and the President agree to a collection of tax cuts and spending increases twice as large as the 2009 Recovery Act. Such fiscal stimulus would make the recession less deep and less lengthy than it would otherwise be. Fewer people would lose their jobs, and those who did lose their jobs would find new jobs more quickly. My second point is that notwithstanding the historically large amount of federal debt outstanding, the government has plenty of budget capacity to use fiscal stimulus vigorously. The legislation I just described would have a direct budgetary impact of about $1.7 trillion, but higher GDP means higher taxable incomes, so the federal government would recoup some of the direct cost, leaving a net cost around $1.1 trillion. That figure is very large by almost any standard, but it represents only about 1 year's worth of federal borrowing at our current pace. Holding off debt by a year would not be worth the lost national output and suffering that would come from a deeper or longer recession. Indeed, the Tax Act of 2017 is generating a larger budgetary cost and a smaller increase in national income than the fiscal stimulus I just described. If your goal is to raise national income at a low budgetary cost, fiscal stimulus would be a more effective route to do that than the tax law. Moreover, the income gains from fiscal stimulus would be more widely shared across the income distribution than the income gains from the tax law, a consideration that I think should be central to your thinking. To be clear, federal debt cannot increase indefinitely relative to the size of the economy, and you or your successors will ultimately raise taxes and cut benefits and services. But market interest rates on federal debt are now at historically low levels and have been trending down for decades. Federal borrowing is thus less costly, less risky, and less harmful to the economy in the long run than most economists have expected. The urgency of putting federal debt on a sustainable path is therefore greatly lessened. My third point is that effective fiscal stimulus requires that spending increases and tax cuts be targeted appropriately. Effective stimulus requires that government spending increases occur quickly, which is easier for certain payments to people and state governments than for projects to build new infrastructure. Effective stimulus also requires that tax cuts be spent quickly by the recipients, which is much more likely for cuts aimed at lower and middle income households than higher income households. Moreover, both spending increases and tax cuts would have larger and more beneficial effects if they were focused on parts of the country that have especially high unemployment in the next recession. In addition, because recessions are difficult to predict and the legislative process often works slowly, as the chairman noted, it would be valuable to build more anti-recessionary policy into law today with a trigger for activation. In sum, the federal government can and should undertake vigorous fiscal stimulus to counteract the next recession, and such stimulus can and should be built into law before the recession arrives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, and I now recognize Dr. Aljawhari for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify on the steps that the federal government should undertake to ensure the U.S. economy is prepared in the event of a recession. It's an honor and privilege to contribute to this committee's work. The United States is currently experiencing one of the longest periods of economic expansion in its history. However, the expansion has not reached all households, and many continue to struggle with long unemployment spells. At the same time, economic growth appears to be slowing, and there are warning signs that a recession is possible in the near future. While downturns are difficult to predict, policymakers have a responsibility both to assess whether the country is prepared for the next recession and to implement approaches to protect Americans from the worst outcomes. The standard tools for combating a recession may prove less effective in the future, in part because the Fed has less room to cut interest rates, and discretionary fiscal policy, while still potentially effective, relies on politicians' willingness to use it the right way, which is not always the case. Case in point, during the Great Recession, Congress engaged in austerity measures, reducing spending well before the economy fully recovered. Automatic stabilizers are a tool that can help mitigate the effects of recession. Enabled once the economy hits a downturn, these stabilizers, such as the expansion of unemployment insurance, are effective in helping steady the economy. During the Great Recession, unemployment insurance kept more than 5 million people out of poverty and prevented 1.4 million foreclosures. Unemployment insurance closed more than 18% of the shortfall in GDP in the aftermath of the Great Recession. Unfortunately, since the last recession, states have reduced these UI benefits, thereby diminishing their positive effects. It is crucial that Congress update existing automatic stabilizers using both academic studies of previous efforts and policy professionals' experience in implementation gleaned from the Great Recession. Several guidelines should be implemented in existing policies to create an instant response that would bolster the United States' economic stability without the need for legislative action in a potentially gridlocked Congress. These principles should underlie almost any automatic stabilization policy. First, ensure that policymakers can increase and extend the benefits of automatic programs and that they are not tightened before all demographic groups and regions have recovered. Two, when appropriate, tie the triggers to activate automatic stabilizers to economic indicators such as unemployment and GDP. Third, make federal fiscal relief to states substantial, automatic, and prolonged so the states do not engage in austerity measures before the economy is recovered. And then finally, require strong maintenance of effort provisions during downturns so that states do not use the federal funds simply just to replace their own. There are 3 programs that can be updated to either make them stronger automatic stabilizers or make to work better as an automatic stabilizer. First, the unemployment insurance system is a crucial automatic stabilizer that provides a soft landing for individuals who face layoffs or experience joblessness. Due to the severity of the Great Recession, states depleted their reserves and therefore had to borrow from the federal government to cover UI benefits. In response to the funding issues, many states have decreased UI payouts through dramatic and historically unprecedented reductions. These include reductions in the number of weeks of available benefits, stricter eligibility requirements, and new disqualifications. To reverse these trends, there are several steps that can be taken to make UI a stronger and more effective automatic stabilizer. First, the federal tax base can be increased from its current level of $7,000 to $18,000, which is the level the base would have been had it matched inflation. Second, in response to several states reducing the maximum benefit duration level, the federal government should incentivize states to maintain the maximum benefit duration to 26 weeks. Second, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, provides a crucial role in reducing economic hardship and providing food assistance for low-income citizens. In 2018, SNAP provided food assistance to 1 out of 8 Americans, including the elderly, disabled, and children. SNAP can be made more effective as an automatic stabilizer by removing the work requirements and by increasing benefits by 15% during a downturn. These provisions have the benefit of expanding eligibility for the program, which in turn improves the stimulus effect of spending by SNAP recipients. Third, one issue for states during a downturn is that almost all face balanced budget rules. This becomes difficult during a downturn because spending rises while revenues fall. Thus, states must make decisions about which programs to cut, which inevitably falls on programs like SNAP, Medicaid, and CHIP. In previous recessions, to ameliorate these issues, the federal government has provided funds to supplement these programs. This policy can be turned into an automatic stabilizer by linking federal disbursement to rising unemployment rates. This policy has the benefit of maintaining spending on the programs that are crucial for those affected by downturns while easing the burden on the states. In conclusion, everyone is asking when the next recession will be coming. I believe this is the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask is, are we ready? We are not ready because the tools at our disposal are less effective than they were during the Great Recession. We can rectify this by strengthening automatic stabilizers like unemployment insurance, SNAP, and Medicaid, especially since they take effect once the economy hits a downturn. But the time to update these programs is now. We cannot wait.
I thank you for your testimony, Doctor, and now I recognize Mr. Hicks for 5 minutes.
Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me today. My association's membership consists of the states and territories' executive branch budget offices, and I'm here today to talk about their perspectives on federal fiscal response during past recessions. States have balanced budget requirements. State revenues are pro-cyclical with the economy. Over 80% of our revenues come from taxing income and consumption. These two factors cause states to cut spending and sometimes raise revenues during recessions, both of which can worsen the impact of declining economic conditions. In fiscal 2008, prior to the Recovery Act, 20 states had revenue shortfalls and most cut spending to balance that year. State general fund revenues declined by 11% in fiscals 2009 and 10. Almost 1/3 of the states had revenue declines in excess of 15%. States received federal fiscal relief in the last two recessions. In both the 2003 legislation and the Recovery Act, Congress highlighted the intent to provide fiscal relief to prevent more significant spending cuts and tax increases. The 2003 Act provided $20 billion to states for fiscals 2003 and 2004. States received a flexible grant of $10 billion and an increase in the federal Medicaid matching rate that resulted in a little over $10 billion. The 2009 Recovery Act had two primary state fiscal relief funding streams: an increase in the federal share of the Medicaid program and the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund to relieve fiscal burdens on states and local educational agencies. They combined to provide about $148 billion, with Medicaid being $99 billion of that, and covered portions of 4 state fiscal years. The scope of the relief provided by the Recovery Act was significant. The two relief programs covered 8.7% of state general fund spending in fiscal 2010 and 7.4% in fiscal 2011. The level of state spending cuts and tax increases that were mitigated by the federal relief was substantial. Even with this relief, states still had to impose multiple years of spending cuts, drew down most of the rainy day fund reserves, and took both temporary and permanent actions to raise revenues. Without this relief, elementary and secondary education, higher education, and Medicaid would have incurred substantial spending cuts just so states could balance their budgets. After most of the federal relief expired in fiscal 2011, states faced a fiscal cliff. The economic recovery was inching forward slowly. State funding for Medicaid had to go up 20%, and further spending cuts were made, with higher education cuts of almost 10%. The last recession had lingering effects on state budgets. At the end of fiscal year 2018, half of the states are not spending at their fiscal year 2008 level when adjusted for inflation, and only about 1/3 of the 183,000 fewer state employees have been added back to the workforce. So what worked in the Recovery Act? It greatly helped to alleviate state fiscal troubles. Without the Recovery Act, state budget cuts and tax increases would have been more substantial. The Recovery Act delivered the largest amount of federal relief to state governments through the Medicaid program. This served the dual purposes of targeting spending to the largest health safety net program when enrollments were increasing, and the Act's intent of freeing up state dollars that prevented more severe budget cuts in other parts of state government. The timing of the start of the two main federal relief programs aligned fairly well with the most difficult state budget years of the recession. The majority of the Recovery Act funds were delivered to states through pre-existing federal grant programs. This facilitated the speed of spending the funds. The Recovery Act flowed the stabilization fund through the governors of each state. This ensured that the entire state budget was taken into consideration when arraying the funds across multiple fiscal years. Federal-state communication during the implementation of the Recovery Act went well. The communication and cooperation among the administration, the GAO, and the states was well executed through multiple layers of participants. So what recommendations do budget officers have? The expiration of federal fiscal relief to states in the last recession didn't match up with the lagged improvement in state revenues. The timing of the expiration of federal aid during recessionary periods could be improved by targeting based on specific economic or fiscal metrics rather than a fixed date. The Recovery Act included other goals for states, which made it difficult to navigate. The new focus on counting jobs within the accountability provisions directed an important responsibility onto grant recipients rather than a centralized entity with the capabilities to ensure uniformity of measurements. And a process for sustained institutional contact among federal, state, and local government partners is warranted. One action that would advance this idea is the proposed legislation by Representative Connolly, H.R. 3883, Restore the Partnership Act, which proposes to establish the Commission on Intergovernmental Relations of the United States. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Examining and considering the lessons learned ahead of the next economic downturn is a wise undertaking.
Thank you for your testimony. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, now recognize you for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee for the privilege of coming to here today to discuss economic resiliency. As has been noted, the U.S. economy has already demonstrated considerable resiliency, and there is not an imminent recession. I think it's important to recognize that we have essentially a two-part economy. One part, household sector, is quite strong and has been growing at an average rate of about 2.7% year over year, pretty steadily since 2016. It's bolstered by a very strong labor market with unemployment at historic lows, 3.5%, rising wages, including the wages of the least skilled and least well off, and that's the good news part of the story. You often hear a lot of the bad news part of the story, which is a weak housing market. It's been that way for 2 years now. Diminished business fixed investment, which is a concern, and the obvious problems in the global economy and the U.S. trade sector, which are a real headwind for the U.S. economy. But with 70% of the economy growing at above 2.5%, it's hard to imagine getting into negative territory, so a recession really isn't imminent. Having said that, I think the best way to think about maintaining and expanding the economic resiliency is to think hard about what we can do to raise the trend rate of economic growth. There's a lot of attention on the cycle, but how fast you grow on average is actually really important. Bad things happen all the time in economics. Fukushimas and other natural disasters happen. There's strikes, as there is in the auto sector right now. You get a Boeing MAX 737 shutdown, and those are negative shocks to the economy. If you're drifting along at 1% or 0.5%, not growing very rapidly, those negative shocks can quickly put you into negative territory. That scares people and it snowballs, and you end up with a greater probability of recession. If you're growing at 2.5%, those same events do not drive you into negative territory, and the economy is more likely to survive without the necessity of some sort of response to a recession. So I think the Congress should now do the things they can to bolster the trend rate of economic growth. And the chairman mentioned some of the ones that I would single out in my testimony. Certainly trade has been an important part of generating productivity and economic growth in the United States. The USMCA is something that the Congress could do right now to solidify the long-term trend rate of growth. Tax reform is unfinished business in my view. Yes, there was a bill passed in 2017, but there are a lot of opportunities still to make the tax code permanently better, not to have provisions that sunset, which are never, in my view, good economic policy, to do some base broadening and improve the investment and innovation incentives. Those are things that the Congress could do now, put in place a stronger foundation. Chairman mentioned the importance of the regulatory reforms that we've seen in recent years, and I really think this is one of the least well understood aspects of what's gone on in the past couple of years. We keep track of every regulation issued by the federal government. During the 8 years of the Obama administration, it issued a major regulation at an average rate of 1.1 per day for 8 years, a total self-reported cost for the private sector to comply of $890 billion. Since the Trump administration entered, the net regulatory burden has been cut by about $10 billion. So we've stopped the expansion in the regulatory state. That could be made statutory, not leave it to the executive branch, find a way to put budgets on the agencies in the same way we put budgets on taxpayer dollars and minimize the burden on the economy. And I think there are other things like immigration reform, and certainly for this committee, putting the debt on a sustainable trajectory that would improve the long-term outlook in beneficial ways. Having said that, there will be a recession. I think we all acknowledge that. And the logic of automatic stabilizers is impeccable. I have no reason to worry about that. What I'm concerned about is how do you operationalize the notion of bigger and better automatic stabilizers? I haven't seen a case yet on why these ones are too small. And so how big the stabilizer should be, I think, is an open quantitative question, and how we make that decision is going to be hard. I worry, as the ranking member did, about expanding mandatory spending. This is the key budgetary problem, and these would be big expansions of mandatory spending. And I worry about doubling up. I think it's almost impossible for an elected member of Congress in the face of a recession to go back to a town hall and say, hey, our predecessors took care of this, don't worry about it. It will happen automatically. So we'll get both automatic stabilizers and discretionary countercyclical policy. That might be overdoing it. And so I'm not convinced we need to do this. So I thank you for the chance to be here today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. And just to clarify, you referred to things that he did as chairman. He was chairman, and a very good one. So
My apologies, Mr. Garland.
No, it's fine. I just don't want to take credit for what you're giving Mr. Womack credit for. Well, thank you all for your testimony. We will now begin the question and answer period. The ranking member and I will defer our questions till the end. So I now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your incredible leadership and for these issues that you bring to the Budget Committee. Thank you all for your testimony. Although the Great Recession officially ended 10 years ago, the bottom 50% of households have only just regained their wealth, which I find appalling. We know from our studies of the last recession that certain programs, and you refer to these, including SNAP and TANF and unemployment insurance, are especially effective in stabilizing the economy during recessions, and they could be even more effective in dampening the harms of recession if they were available to more people with fewer barriers to entry. But we do hear a lot of criticism about how we can't afford to pay for these programs because the programs increase federal debt. And these arguments are used to justify cutting flexible spending programs that help people in need. And they're used to justify the placement of high barriers like onerous and discriminatory work requirements. We hear similar arguments against the creation of bold new programs that would address important problems like homelessness, our crumbling infrastructure, or climate change. And so today I'd just like to investigate a little bit how strategic government spending, even government spending financed by debt, actually helps our economy. And Dr. Elmendorf, I thought your testimony was incredibly insightful. There is widespread concern that the U.S. may experience a recession in the near future. And with interest rates already low, you referred to this in your testimony, the Federal Reserve is going to have even less space to intervene. Does that mean that we have to rely on fiscal policies, even if they include significant federal spending, to limit the severity of a recession?
Yes, Congresswoman, I think it does mean that. We are currently running budget deficits of $1 trillion a year or so. The proposal I offered, which was just illustrative, we don't know how much fiscal stimulus we will need in the next recession, but even a very large piece of fiscal stimulus would add as much to the debt as we add every year now in what people have discussed as a strong economy. It would be a terrible mistake to run significant deficits when the economy is humming along, and then to decide we can't run deficits when the economy needs that support. So I think we are looking for more fiscal stimulus in the next recession than we had in the last one.
Well, you're sort of getting at my next question, which is exactly that. Even during a recession, we hear that we can't afford to increase federal spending because it'll increase debt. But in your testimony, you asserted that the Great Recession would have been less destructive and long had the government spent twice as much. Can you explain why key investments in federal programs and not austerity policies are actually more effective in heading off a recession?
So there are a few issues here, Congresswoman. One is that fiscal stimulus can come from tax cuts as well as spending increases, and I referred to both in complete parallel through my remarks. The choice of what sort of stimulus to use depends on your and your colleagues' judgments, partly about the economic effects, and we can talk about the benefits of targeting and so on, partly in your assessments of what is most important to have in our country. Is it to have more consumer spending, or is it to have through tax cuts, or is it to have more support for people who need support, and is it to have more investments in the future? So one very important role of government spending is to provide investments in our future. Some of those are investments in research and development, or investments in infrastructure, and currently federal spending for those purposes is about the smallest percentage of our economic output. It has been in my entire lifetime. That is not a forward-looking policy. But also there is a growing body of evidence that some of the social programs that provide support for low-income families give the children in those families permanent advantages over their lives in the incomes that they can earn when they go to work. And so there are investments in both the productivity-enhancing R&D and infrastructure, but also in the productivity-enhancing skills of children who can get better access to the education they need with the right sort of federal support.
Thank you. That investment early on in kids is so important, and Dr. Aljawhari, you refer to this with your comments about SNAP, for example. Why is investment in programs for low-income and middle-class people crucial for preparing for and responding to recessions? Again, even though that increase might increase federal debt, even though that spending might increase federal debt.
One of the things, thank you for your question, Congresswoman. One of the things that we need to understand is that these programs have a stimulus effect. And so, as was mentioned before, that 70%, consumer spending is 70% of GDP. And so that's been very good. Consumer confidence is still pretty good. And so what we need to do is emphasize further consumer spending. And the stimulus effect is larger for low-income and middle-class families. And so when we think about these automatic stabilizers, one of the things that we have to focus on, one of the things that we miss is that people want to work. And so we want to have programs that help people stay attached to the labor force. So that means it's not just, finding a job, but it's also putting food on the table, which SNAP helps with. It's also taking care of your health care, which Medicaid helps with. And so we have all these programs so that people can better able to find a job when they lose their job. And so that's why we need to focus on that, because of that stimulus effect that would help consumer spending and therefore boosting GDP.
Thank you so much. My time has expired.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today marks 177 days since this committee has failed to adopt a budget and pass a budget. It's the Budget Committee. Speaker Pelosi has said numerous times that a budget is a statement of your values, and every party should do a budget. Yet her party is in power, and they're not doing a budget. They don't care about the people's house right now. They care about making it a house of investigations. This is the Budget Committee. Let's see your budget. It's been 177 days, and we still haven't had it. Thanks to the policies championed by President Trump and the work of a Republican Congress in his first 2 years in office, we have a booming economy. GDP was 3.1% in 2018, last year. This was the highest in 13 years. Our GDP was the highest in 13 years last year at 3.1. First quarter of 2019, we were at 3.1 GDP. Just in the last couple weeks, we hit the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. The lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. You know who's benefited from a very, very low unemployment rate? The low-wage workers. I represent one of the poorest congressional districts in the country. My people have benefited the most under the policies of the first 2 years of a Republican Congress and a Trump administration. With all the deregulations, with the lower taxes, with the doubling of the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000, with lowering the tax rates for low-income families, doubling the standard deduction. This has helped the folks in Southeast Missouri. You know, there was a recent article that analyzed an economist's view of wage growth amongst low-income workers, low-income sectors. And in fact, it was comparing low-income sectors that included retail, restaurants, clothing stores, casino workers, and in fact, those employees have seen the largest wage growth than any other sector. That's great news. But no one's talking about it. And the reason why that they are benefiting with higher wage growth is because of the tight labor force. Like I just said, the lowest unemployment rate in the history of our country, which was just announced. And that was created because of the policies of the Republican Congress the last 2 years and President Trump, with a booming economy that created a 3.1% GDP. We need to champion the fact that those folks that work in restaurants and the retail clothing stores, that they've seen the largest wage growth. Let me read this. Wage growth was truly stagnant only for workers in high-wage industry, such as lawyers, doctors, and broadcasters. Those broadcasters don't want the American people to know that their wages hasn't increased as much as someone who serves them at a restaurant, because they care about their own pocketbook. Let me read something else to you. Earnings growth for low-wage workers, such as those who work in retail and restaurants, like I said, has doubled in the last 5 years. Their wages have doubled in the last 5 years. That's phenomenal. And that is great because of the economy and the policies were passed in the last 2 years. Also, wages for the poorest Americans were rising twice as fast as those hourly earnings for high-wage earners. Those are great things to talk about. And so we need to look at is what created that. Deregulation, which saved families $3,100, that President Trump initiated, and making permanent the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, such as the doubling of the child tax credit and lowering tax rates for all Americans. That's how we can help continue this growth in the economy and the growth in wages for low-income workers.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Mr. Holtz-Eakin, you talked about some of the factors having to do with the growth rate, and I'm on board with a lot of those. You didn't mention immigration, which is another one I would add. And the other thing I had a question for you, though, is what's the effect of federal debt on the growth rate?
So first of all, I did mention immigration in my written testimony. I think it's a very important issue, and the U.S. has never really used immigration as a tool of economic policy, and could, I think, reform its core visa granting programs to take better advantage of that. And I'd be happy to discuss that further if you want. In terms of the debt, the outlook for the debt really has, I think, significant impacts on the capacity for the economy to grow. And the mechanisms are the following. One, every time the federal government borrows a dollar, it takes a dollar that would otherwise be available for investments in skills, innovation, capital. That's an important channel by which the debt affects the economy. It's not too visible at any point in time, but it's sort of a slow, corrosive opportunity lost. And we're doing an enormous amount of that right now. The second thing is, at some point, it's not today, if you're a businessman looking at investing someplace in the globe and you look at the United States and it has a fundamental mismatch in its federal budget, you have to start asking yourself, well, how does this get resolved? Does it get resolved by a crisis? Certainly we hope not, but that's not a pro-growth strategy. We could just tax and close that gap. That's not a pro-growth strategy. Or we could get the core spending programs under control and have a revenue stream that matches them. But only one of those three is good news.
Right. Well, let me ask you about that.
That's a bad news thing.
But is it appropriate to cut taxes on high income earners who are particularly wealthy individuals at a time when the economy's strong? Doesn't that really that adds to the retardation of the growth rate, doesn't it?
I think that you ought to think about tax policy not in terms of just high income individuals, but what will be the incentives for saving, investment, and growth over the long term.
Right.
And tax policy should be designed to heighten those to the extent possible.
Also, it has to be designed to cover your expenses at some level.
Yes, and we're not close at the moment.
And Mr. Elmendorf, I'd ask you, I keep hearing that debt is a long-term issue. But it does seem to me that, we hear that we're going to be spending more on interest payments than children in 3 years and more on interest payments than defense in 5 years. Isn't this something that's with us right now?
Well, as you know, Congressman, federal debt is now at a historically high level relative to GDP. Right. As I noted, that's a problem that you or your successors will ultimately confront. I think the question is when and how. And so when you talk about when to confront that, it is good to do when an economy is strong,
like it
bad to do if the economy is on the edge of recession or in a recession or in the first part of a recovery. And then you come to the question of how, and you have to decide on behalf of citizens like me what we want the society to be about. And so when you think about tax policy, it is about raising revenue. It is about the incentive effects, as Doug said. It is also about who's bearing the burden. And given the great divergence of incomes in this country over the last several decades, and in particular the slow growth of incomes for people in the bottom half of the income distribution, I think it's appropriate to have the burden borne more by people who are higher up in the income distribution. And I would also just emphasize that the when federal dollars reduce private investment in innovation and so on, that can be a cost, but also if budget stringency reduces federal investments in R&D and in education and so on, that also has a cost for the future growth of the economy.
No, 100%. I don't mind the idea of investing. I think we should be investing in that sort of thing. I don't like the idea of accruing interest payments, which are becoming a bigger part of the pie. And in the face of this, in the course of this economy, which is very strong, the majority in the last Congress cut taxes in a way that seemed to me that was unresponsive to the need to fill the gap in the debt, and also ignored the effect, the slowing of growth that happens from this debt over time. And I think we're going to have to recover from that in what you call the next tax policy. But really, just quickly, Mr. Elmendorf, broadly speaking, with respect to housing, in the last recession, we responded to the crisis by providing 7 to 9 million homeowners consumers relief, enabling them to restructure their mortgage. But the worth for the typical household plunged by about 40%, and economic inequality is exacerbated. Can you, in a few seconds, tell me how you think our response for homeowners did, and whether we could do better next time?
A lot of smart people worked really hard to develop policies to help homeowners in the last downturn. I don't think we were terribly successful in the end, but I think that importantly reflects the difficulty of that challenge. Too many people bought houses they couldn't really afford on the hope that house prices would keep rising, and they didn't keep rising. It was very hard to solve that problem, so I wish more had been done, but I don't think it was so straightforward. I think it is important going forward that we have the right sorts of regulation that help people avoid avoidable risks like that.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I appreciate the opportunity. It's really an honor to be here because this is something I'd love to talk on for about the rest of my time in Congress. Being a businessman for 35 years before I came here, I've only been in Congress not quite a year now. I do find it quite humorous on the conversation here that if somehow we did not have the tax increase, that somehow we would automatically start paying down debt. This never happened. It's only happened really 4 years in a row in our lifetime, and that was under President Clinton, and then our House was Republican-led and the Senate Republican-led when everybody got together and had a thing called welfare work reform. And it is an interesting thing because the only way we're going to work it out in our economy, the way it's structured, is that we have more people working, paying in taxes, and less dependent on the federal government. That's really what happened. We had 9/11 to come along. I remind us of our history, changed the world economy forever, and now we're right back to where we are, running gigantic deficits and enormous debt that's really got to be troubling to all of us, regardless of the side you're on, which really demands we have a budget, one that really determines how we're going to spend those revenues. In fact, if you look out the next 10 years of the budget window, it's incredibly devastating to what is our, once many of us are gone, what we're going to be leaving our kids and grandkids in the future. Somebody's going to have to pay the piper at some point in the future. So to say that we're just going to all of a sudden, if we got those tax reforms back, that we were going to change our direction is, all due respect, I just think it's a joke. I've not seen that in my time here. It's how can we spend more, and nobody has the intestinal fortitude to want to cut anything. I do think it is irresponsible, though, to not cut spending with the revenues we have. And so it is interesting. I do find it interesting, Mr. Elmendorf, you said that the wealthy ought to pay more of their fair share. They're paying well over half of the American taxes, up or 2 or 3% are paying well over the half the tax. So I don't know what you describe as fair. Maybe it's all of what they earn, and it still wouldn't be enough. In fact, we could take almost all the revenue generated in the United States and have a difficult time paying off our debt. And so I don't know exactly where we're going with this, but other than we've got to figure out how we get our arms around increasing our participation rate. As a person who was in the welfare system as a young child for a number of years, it wasn't because of a person who couldn't work, it's because they didn't want to work. And there were plenty of jobs, and you know, at least I didn't go hungry, I guess, but his hardest job was to run to the mailbox and get a food stamp check when it was still going to the mailbox. Now we make it really easy today. We just send it to your checking account. I do find it interesting also that we don't want to have people who are able-bodied adults without dependents actually have to work or get an education to get a job that might be available with over 7 million people, or 7 million jobs in America today. And we've got 6 million plus that are looking for jobs, and obviously their skills or their geographics don't match up where those jobs are, so they should get a training that would allow them to go to work and be less dependent on the federal government, not more. To the height of about 17 million people on food stamps in 2008 to a height of about 46 million people in 2015, now back down to about 38 million people on food stamps today. We should design a system, I would hope, that would not just be a fiscal cliff for them, but that would actually encourage them to move on to a job, not be fearful of getting a raise or getting a better job for losing their benefits. So, with all that said, could we talk about, and we can start with you, sir, regarding the participation rate. What kind of policies could we put in place that would help us grow our participation rate with our job seekers?
I think the prime-age male and prime-age female participation rates are the things that are most troubling right now. We've not regained some past levels on those. With the retirement of the baby boom generation, the overall participation rate has a lot of downward pressure on it. That's inevitable. You want to have, I think, a strong foundation. And to be honest, the thing I am most troubled about right now is the fact that in our K-12 education system, we do annual testing, and those tests, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, indicate that a quarter to a third of 4th and 8th graders are seriously deficient in math and reading. So a quarter to a third of future workers are going to come into the labor force unable to compete effectively and probably unable to participate. And that, I think, is an enormous mistake for the United States and something that's not being focused on. So getting people to enter the labor force equipped to compete is very important, and then having a very work-friendly social safety net so that there aren't barriers to work is the second piece.
Mr. Holtz-Eakin, is it fair to say that our systems were designed to have a number of more people working to support those who need? And so if we have less people working today, then we've got a real problem that's a structural problem, not necessarily a fiscal problem, but a structural problem. We just do not have enough workers in America to feed the opportunities we have to take care of folks when they need the safety net programs. Whether it be Social Security, Medicare, SNAP, the list goes on and on. We need more workers in America.
Yes.
And if we drove fill these jobs, we could have a better GDP, change the trend that you talked about, have an immigration policy. You mentioned visas, that we could bring workers in to fill these jobs to grow our economy.
And importantly, not just have people at work, but have people with skills and have equipment that raise productivity. One of the beneficial things we've seen in the past couple of years is a resurgence in productivity growth. Was under 1%. It's now up at about 2.5%. I don't know if that's going to continue, but if it does, that's the single most important piece of good news that we have seen. In the long run, productivity growth is everything. It's how the standard of living goes up. It's how you manage to support a higher number of seniors given the labor force.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
I promised you some extra time.
You did. Thank you, sir.
If you want to ask another question, you're welcome to.
Well, let's talk about participation rate just a second. When we looked back in 97 through 2001, our participation rate was just short of 68%. Today it's at 63%. Do you feel today at a 68% participation rate, if that were achievable, that we would be in a different direction? Or is this a different time for a different set of numbers?
Yeah, I'm always nervous about comparisons to the late 90s. In the late 90s, the world was a safer place. The Soviet Union had fallen apart. It's not a safer place right now. In the late 90s, discretionary spending was the dominant part of the budget. It was easier to deal with. That's not true right now. Late 90s gave us a dot-com bubble and a productivity boom. Turned out that was illusory. We don't want to have another bubble as the key to economic and other successes. And in the late 90s, the retirement of the baby boom generation was 2 decades away. It's here. And so we are in a different place right now. And we need to acknowledge that and deal with the problems we have right now using new solutions, not the things we did in the 1990s.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Cirrus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been here now 13 years, and I came here when Paulson, I was in financial services, and Paulson came in before the committee. I thought he was going to cry as he was describing the financial situation in this country. And it really made an impact on me. We had difficult votes to take. We were able to save the auto industry. We were able to save basically this country with all the things with the Recovery Act that we put together. So as things came along, one of the things that I was upset about, and it's one of the things I want to talk to you about, is investment in infrastructure. I did not feel that we did enough investment doing the Recovery Act on infrastructure. And here we are now looking to see what we can do to prevent any kind of recession in the future, and we don't seem to be making the investment that we need in infrastructure. I was just wondering, how do you feel about investment in infrastructure as a way of hedging off any kind of recessions, or what part of it is it?
So, Congressman, I think infrastructure investment is very important for the long-term growth of the economy, and my judgment agrees with yours that we should be doing more infrastructure investment in this country. But its role in fighting recessions is hindered by the fact that many forms of infrastructure have long setup times. If we're trying to fix the airports around New York City, that's not a thing that really is shovel-ready. That's the thing that takes time to prepare. So throwing a lot of money at infrastructure during a period of economic weakness may or may not lead to extra spending when the economy needs it. As it turned out in the last recession, it was long enough and deep enough that even the slow payout of infrastructure spending turned out to provide important stimulus as that went on. But for many recessions in this country that have been shorter, infrastructure spending can come late. So it's important for long-term growth, but I would say less central to addressing a recession when a recession hits, which is why some of the comments here have been more about payments to individuals and payments to states.
So rather than having a larger stimulus infrastructure, do I understand that you favor a strong amount of money, even?
Yes.
In order to head off any kind of recessions?
Well, I think we should have a higher level of infrastructure investment funded by the federal government to ensure the long-term growth of the country. I don't think that will particularly forestall a recession or is the best way to address a recession when it hits.
I was wondering, you were talking about immigration. And can you tell me how immigration would help? Because it seems that it's become a bad word around here, immigration.
So let me first just say that there is complete agreement across the ideological spectrum on every word that Doug Elmendorf just said on the infrastructure. It's not a cyclical issue. It should be dealt with as a proactive policy of raising the trend growth rate. That's a good idea. Immigration. The reality is that native-born Americans do not have enough kids. So in the absence of immigration, the size of the population will shrink. It will become increasingly old. The size of the economy will shrink and will be a less vital and less important presence on the world stage. The flip side to that is all of our choices about the future reside on how we want to run our immigration system. Who are we going to admit and what are we going to value? Traditionally, the United States has focused on humanitarian issues in immigration. The last reforms were done in the 60s, and the primary criteria were family unification and refugee and asylum status. I think indicative of the character of this country. But many other of our competitor developed countries use immigration as a tool of economic policy, and I think it would be a good idea for us to do that too. Under 5% of our permanent visas are granted for economic reasons. we could establish criteria by which we wanted people to come in who were going to be able to bring their productivity to the United States, bring their entrepreneurial vigor. Immigrants traditionally work more, work longer, start businesses, create jobs. We can take advantage of that going forward in a more systemic fashion.
So in other words, we used to think in terms of immigration on a humanitarian basis, but they still worked, and they still contribute.
They did, and so without trying, they have contributed enormously. If we tried, we could do better.
It was still a stimulus for the economy.
Yeah, it's essential.
It's essential.
Yes.
And here we are today, somehow thinking that immigration is bad in this, coming to this country, because there are jobs in this country that, even though you get a 5% of well-educated people coming into the country, there are jobs they're not going to do. And we need that immigration of people, those startup jobs that come on humanitarian basis to become part of the American economy. I mean, I see it in my district. I see it myself. I was an immigrant. I came here when I was 11 years old. I saw my parents, no education, worked in a factory, yet they contribute. So I just think we have to rethink this issue of immigration, that we want selective immigration. There's got to be a way that we can bring immigration so people can add to the economy like they've done in the past. This country was built on immigration. And most of them came humanitarian necessities. So there you are. I've been over. Sorry, I apologize.
That's all right. Gentleman's time has expired. Now, recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Isn't it interesting? We're talking about the need for infrastructure. We're talking about the need for an immigration system that works. How do we fund those? My gosh, it sounds like we're talking about the need for a budget. Isn't that a novel idea? I don't know why we're here today talking about a policy on how to improve economic resiliency. I'm deeply concerned by the premise of today's hearing that an economic recession is imminent, and that Congress needs to enact new automatic economic stabilizers to ease the effects of an impending economic downturn. This is a false premise. The economy is strong. In fact, the United States economy is undergoing the largest economic expansion in American history. The unemployment rate is at a 50-year low. 6.4 million new jobs have been created since November of 2016. And under the new Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, American families are keeping more of their hard-earned money. As the Federal Reserve Vice Chairman Richard Clarida stated, the economy continues to be in a good place. So instead of trying to mitigate the damage from a non-existent recession, or to advance a false narrative of an inevitable recession, like many of our colleagues on the left and the national media are doing, solely for the purpose of throttling America's economic surge and striking fear across the nation, all to advance a political agenda, Congress should instead focus on extending our current economic expansion by enacting the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canadian agreement, and reducing burdensome regulations that add billions of dollars in cost to our economy. So, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, the Trump administration has made efforts to reduce the amount of burdensome regulations that hurt American taxpayers and disproportionately affect industries that play an important role in the economies of my district in eastern and southeastern Ohio, such as coal and natural gas. Can you tell me how the reduction in regulatory costs have helped create a more competitive and productive economy?
So I think what the administration has done through executive authority is actually quite remarkable. That they have instituted regulatory budgets in all the agencies, and I think that's the right way to do this. You let the agencies develop the regulations they need, but they have a budget, and they can't just do something without an offset someplace, and you get a smarter regulatory system as a result. I think this should be a statutory regime. I think Congress should pass this as a permanent feature. In doing so, you get the same impacts you get from tax policy. Right? Regulations are an overall reduction in resources available to do other things, and they distort the activities of businesses. They have to focus their capital investments not on what's most productive, but what meets the regulatory requirements. And so minimizing to the extent possible those burdens is something is very beneficial for growth. We have less in the way of quantitative estimates of the impact of regulation than we do of tax policy. And obviously there's big disagreements about tax policy. No doubt we would get big disagreements about the impact of the regulatory policy. But given the magnitudes involved, going from over $100 billion a year to zero, I have little question that it's contributed significantly to the post-2016 acceleration.
Okay, so this hearing is discussing potential automatic stabilizers that could be used to minimize the adverse effects of in my view, a false claim of an economic recession. Several ideas have been proposed that involve higher federal spending. In your opinion, could regulatory reform be utilized to mitigate these adverse effects? For example, since federal regulations impose burdensome compliance costs, which would reduce economic growth, could you design a stabilizer in the regulatory space?
You could. As I said in my opening remarks, I'd prefer to first focus on raising the trend rate of growth so that you have less need for stabilizers and less probability of going into a negative GDP growth territory. So there's a lot that can be done on that front, and the regulatory reforms can contribute to it.
Yeah, you know, I find it interesting because if we look, we don't learn from history in our country very well, and I think we tend to forget the successes of our past and our legacy. I mean, we discovered powered flight. We put a man on the moon. We discovered nuclear energy. We discovered internal organ transplants. We built the internet. We brought marvels to the world prior to 1970 when big government came on the scene. We're pretty smart people. If we would just get the government out of the way and spend the money that we take from the taxpayers more effectively and efficiently, we'd be making a lot more progress. Mr. Chairman, thanks for the indulgence. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. His time has expired. And now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, listening to the other side about fiscal responsibility, I got to congratulate them on being able to message fiscal responsibility better than we do. But let's get some facts on the table. Dr. Elmendorf, isn't it a fact that since Nixon, every Republican president has ended up with a worse deficit than they came in? And since Carter, every Democratic president has ended up with a better deficit or even a surplus than they came in with, and that this administration is on track to keep that pattern going?
Yes, Congressman, I think that's a fair description of your very interesting chart.
Thank you. And the next chart is on jobs. You can tell where President Obama's initiative went into effect. That's at the bottom when you're bouncing off the bottom of the chart. And his about $700 billion initiative went into effect. And you can see jobs coming in pretty much flat since then. Can you tell where, without looking at the chart, President Trump was elected, or when his stimulus package twice as big as President Obama's economic package when it went into effect?
No, Congressman. The continued economic expansion over the past few years is a straight extension of the economic expansion that was started years ago under President Obama.
So with a trajectory, with a package twice as big, there's no upward trajectory in jobs?
No, Congressman.
You mentioned, thank you. You mentioned triggers. We have unemployment compensation, which is automatic, SNAP benefits, automatic, Medicaid. And you talked about infrastructure. If we required states to have on-the-shelf, shovel-ready projects, school construction, stuff like that, and provided low-cost or low-interest loans, would that be something that we should have on the shelf in cases of economic decline?
I think, Congressman, there are some infrastructure projects that can be launched fairly readily if the money is available. but not many others. And that's why I, and I think many of my colleagues on this panel, would encourage you and your colleagues to focus on other ways of fighting recessions and to think about infrastructure investment as a longer-term strategy.
Okay, well, you mentioned there are tax cuts and there are other tax cuts, and you said that all tax cuts do not stimulate the economy equally. What do you mean by that?
To stimulate the economy, we need to have tax cuts that encourage households or businesses to spend. So if you think about individual tax cuts that go primarily to higher income individuals are much more likely to be saved than tax cuts that go to lower middle income individuals, and will therefore have less stimulative effect on the economy.
One problem you have with tax cuts is once you get them into effect, they're kind of hard to eliminate, so that a temporary tax cut is difficult. Infrastructure spending you can cut off without as much aggravation. Could you make a comment about if you put these tax cuts in, can you ever get them out?
Well, we put in a two-year payroll, you put in a two-year payroll tax cut to help fight the last recession. And one piece of advice I would offer to you in this committee is to construct a version of that sort of payroll tax cut that would be triggered on by a slowing of the economy and would be triggered off when, but only when, the economy is recovered sufficiently. And I think if you build a tax cut as explicit recession-fighting tool, then I think it's clearer to the American people as well as the members of Congress that this is meant to be temporary.
The gentleman from Missouri went to great lengths to talk about how the lower incomes had increased significantly. Didn't Missouri have an increase in the minimum wage in the last couple of years?
That may be, Congressman. I'm afraid I actually don't know.
Yes. Would an increase in the minimum wage stimulate the economy, particularly on the low end?
Yes, Congressman, I think it would. The analysis that CBO did when I was director and the analysis in the version they've updated more recently shows that raising the minimum wage can reduce employment, but it also provides a great deal of additional income, primarily toward people who are lower down in the income distribution.
And about half of the analysis in the CBO report showed that there'd actually be an increase in jobs. Is that right?
It's a possibility as well, Congressman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since we're in the method of debunking myths, let's talk about that graph where fiscal responsibility was the main focus, and which president from which party was in power at the time. Mr. Elmendorf, it's good to see you again, by the way.
Good to see you too, Congressman.
Since that question was directed at you, I'll direct this one at you as well. Where does the budget start? Does it start with the president or does it start in Congress?
Congressman, I always put the Congress first in my own thinking.
Right. And when we look at that graph, what we would also note, if we cared about the facts, was that a Republican Congress was in power, and both during the Budget Control Acts of 2011 and under the Clinton administration, when we actually had, we actually did not have deficits for a couple of years. I mean, quite amazing stuff there. So the facts do matter. On the CBO analysis, I would point out on the minimum wage that at the upper end, we risked having 3.7 million jobs lost if we went to a $15 minimum wage. So that's just good to know. This next question is for Dr. Holtz-Eakin. Since this is about recession, I want to get to the core of that really quick. The Federal Reserve and other financial institutions monitor the signs of a potential recession. What are the common indicators that a recession is imminent, and should we be worried about those?
So people have their different favorite leading indicators. Traditionally, building permits, housing starts have been good indicators of the business cycle. Orders for durable goods, so on non-defense capital goods, excluding aircraft is my preferred measure. All of these are monthly retail sales, are ways to monitor the confidence and the spending habits of different pieces of the real economy. The other ones that you hear a lot about are financial market indicators, like inversions in the yield curve and the like. I am less a fan of those. I pay less attention to financial markets on a near-term basis because they fluctuate a lot in a way that has nothing to do with the trends. So, but others like those more.
Okay. How much do expectations, how much do you think expectations affect economic outcomes? So if in the public eye we keep talking about a recession, and this is very difficult to measure, I imagine, but do you think that affects economic outcomes?
Yes, and there's a lot of evidence in this from the efforts of the Federal Reserve to set and maintain inflation expectations, and we've seen that. Doug Elmendorf mentioned forward guidance, expectations about the future of policy. These are all important channels for improving the performance of the economy. I'm spending a lot of time looking at consumer confidence right now because the household sector is the bulwark of the economy right now, and continued bad news can dent that confidence, and that's something I'd be concerned about.
Dr. Elmendorf, did you want to comment on that as well?
I would just add, Congressman, I agree that expectations can be important, but I also think that American people expect the Congress to be realistic about future possibilities and risks, and to try to enhance the possibilities and guard against the risks.
Of course, so let's talk about those risks, and if we wanted to be as pessimistic as possible, you know, what risks should we be worried about? And more importantly, what would we do to alleviate those risks? I'll start with you, Mr. Elmendorf. And go here.
Well, I sympathize with Doug Holtz-Eakin's exhortations to try to raise trend growth, but I think that is a complementary policy to policies that would help bolster the economy if it falls into recession. And I disagree with Doug about the automatic stabilizers. We have a set of stabilizers today whose strength is basically a byproduct, an accidental byproduct of tax rules and spending programs that we've built for other purposes. And so there's no reason to think we have the optimal level of automatic stabilizers today. And in fact, if you look back at the past set of recessions in this country, we've had big run-ups in unemployment that have caused a lot of suffering, and stronger automatic stabilizers would have helped to reduce that. And in particular now, with monetary policy having less room to maneuver in the future because market interest rates are already so low, there's clear reasons to think we will need stronger fiscal measures in the future. And that's why I think building stronger automatic stabilizers is important.
Dr. Holtz-Eakin, is it stronger stabilizers or is it more efficient stabilizers that we need? Can you comment on that?
Well, I think the efficiency of a stabilizer really comes down to the issue of how well targeted they are. Are they targeted on the problem? And one of the issues in design I see right now is that in the 20th century, recessions were essentially industrial, inventory-driven, investment-driven events. And in the 21st century, 2000, 2001, dot-com bubble burst, we get a minor recession. In the mid-2000s, we get a credit bubble burst, the housing bubble burst, and we get the Great Recession. These are bubble-driven recessions. Their onset is different, and sort of targeting effectively to offset the initial downturn is an important issue. And I don't know exactly how to do that in this day and age.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, good to see you. Thank you very much for joining us here today, and thank you to all the panelists for participating in this discussion. Dr. Elmendorf, I'd like to start with you. To paraphrase your testimony, in the event of a new recession, our monetary policy is limited by low interest rates. Our fiscal policy can be limited by our timeliness in response, and I would add political considerations. You also outline a stimulus package in your testimony that doubles the ARRA under President Obama. Why have you chosen a value double what was enacted previously? And how did limiting our stimulus as we climbed out of the Great Recession impact our recovery?
So I picked an illustrative stimulus package that was deliberately large because the stimulus that we used in that enacted in 2009 was not sufficiently strong, given the nature of that downturn, the severity of that downturn, and because with monetary policy having less room to cut the federal funds rate than it has had in any of the past recessions, fiscal policy will be more important. So I think there is a reasonable chance that we will need quite a large fiscal stimulus to effectively counter the next recession. And I wanted to discuss the fact that we can afford that despite the large amount of outstanding federal debt. Even a stimulus package that was twice the size of what was the previous largest stimulus package is something for which this country has fiscal capacity.
I think it's worth just pointing out that as you say, it wasn't big enough. It was the Republican Congress that cut that stimulus short. And I think we could have had a much stronger recovery if they hadn't done that.
Yes, Congressman, there was a survey of economists done at the time of the Recovery Act, showed overwhelming support for the view that the Recovery Act boosted output and employment, and a slew of research about that Recovery Act and other forms of fiscal stimulus over time that we've seen in the last decade has strongly confirmed the views at the time that fiscal stimulus is an effective way to put people back to work.
Dr. Aljawhari, automatic stabilizers such as unemployment insurance can also help reduce the impact of a recession. In fact, according to your recent article, unemployment insurance kept more than 5 million people out of poverty and prevented more than 1.4 million foreclosures. Yet states have reduced unemployment insurance benefits since the Great Depression. How will reduced UI benefits slow recovery during the next recession, whenever it occurs?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. It's really important to understand that UI benefits is not just about the individual who is laid off and they're able to spend. It has a stimulus impact on the economy. So if you have a lower benefits, that's less they can spend. So for example, there's 9 states that reduced the maximum benefit duration from 26 weeks down to 20, even down to 14. And even also, they also made stricter eligibility requirements. And so you have some states that if someone was unemployed in 2007, they would end up with that first paycheck of say $3,000. Then in 2017, if that same person would be unemployed, they would end up with like $2,000. That $1,000 from that first payment, that's a loss to the economy, not just to the individual, but to the economy. And so we've had that. So we've had a lot of talk about, well, we may not need this or we shouldn't be worried about the recession, and that's fine, but we've retrenched back on unemployment insurance, which is the first kind of line of defense when we have a recession. As has been mentioned, monetary policy is going to be weaker, fiscal policy is going to be helpful, but once we hit that recession, we need that first kind of, return, that first kind of like punch to like, okay, let's get the economy back going again, and that's what unemployment insurance is. And we've gone back worse than the Great Recession, and so that's why we need to even just get back to par where we were in 2008.
So, I mean, to sort of paraphrase what you're saying and put it in layman's terms, there's no real downside to having strong unemployment insurance because it's something that not only helps people who need the help, it just helps the broader economy.
Exactly. And the other thing is that we don't have to worry too much about the debt burden of it because when you have a job, you don't get insurance benefits. And so when you lose your job, you get benefits, but then you get a job again, then it's not mandatory spending that's constant. It's just once you lose a job. And then you get a job again, it goes away.
By definition, it's an automatic stabilizer.
Right.
Dr. Elmendorf, we could address the reduction in UI among states by extending the length of benefits when unemployment grows, offering more to states with higher unemployment rates. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that this would cost approximately $25 billion during a normal recession. How might this expansion reduce the length and severity of the next recession, and how else might we amend automatic stabilizers before a recession arrives?
Strengthening the role of the unemployment...
I apologize, I don't have much time left, so I want to be... You can answer. Okay.
Strengthening the role of the unemployment insurance system, as has been suggested, I think would have 2 very important advantages. One is that it would alleviate the harm suffered by people who lose jobs when the economy slows down. Also, it would provide continued spending that would help maintain some momentum in the economy. But on the second piece of maintaining momentum in the economy, you all will need to do more than that because we have a very large economy, $20 trillion of annual output now, and a slowdown to be effectively countered, you'll need to bring some real force to bear. And that's why I think you and your colleagues should think about a collection of policies, a collection of ways to strengthen automatic stabilizers in order to reduce the damage that will occur to the economy and individual families whenever the economy next goes into recession.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to you all very much for being here with us. It's terrific having former CBO directors. As a former Revenue Secretary from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Dr. Elmendorf, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Congressman.
So, a couple of questions. Clearly, our public debt is a bipartisan issue. We've averaged 42% of our debt as to GDP over the last 50 years. 79% versus GDP today, projected to continue to grow as we all know. So first question is the tax cuts versus stimulus discussion. We've had a large tax reform a couple of years ago, and in my numbers, it shows that at this point, the idea of gaining tax or revenue neutrality, we're not quite there yet. It's added approximately $160 billion, and again, my numbers to the current deficit yet out of 900 trillion or 900 billion, but it's done wonders to the economy. There's really no denying that. I mean, we have a very robust economy, wages, unemployment in every demographic, manufacturing, new business starts. A lot of great things are happening versus the stimulus, one could argue, did not have the same sort of returns and yet could arguably say cost more. So what is your response, and Dr. Elmendorf, I'll ask you, to tax cuts versus stimulus package?
Well, Congressman, as I read the evidence from CBO and from outside analysts, the 2017 Tax Act was expected to boost economic output by a little bit. Now, given everything else going on in the economy, it's always hard to tell whether something has had the effect one predicted. But I think as analysts look at what has transpired since that Tax Act took effect, it's quite consistent, at least, with the view that there was a notable short-term boost in growth rates in 2018, but now the economy has slowed to the growth rates of GDP and employment it had before that boost. And so I think the evidence is consistent with the view that there will be a small positive effect on GDP of the tax law. If you look at stimulus legislation, that would occur during a recession. So if you just tried to do that now with the unemployment rate already at 3.5%, you wouldn't get so much. But my analysis here was, or my suggestion drawing on serious analyses was, in a recession when there are people unemployed, and if the Federal Reserve has already cut the federal funds rate close to zero, which seems quite likely, then under those conditions, you get quite a large short-term boost to GDP from a short-term increase in the budget deficit through either tax cuts or spending increases. It's not just about spending increases. There's stimulus from tax cuts of the right sort. But you get a pretty big boost in GDP. And thus, you get a larger dynamic effect on tax revenue, which I believe and have argued should be included in estimates you see for important pieces of legislation. But you get a pretty big feedback effect. And that's why the numbers from that I think make sense, given the uncertainties, are a bigger boost at for a smaller cost for the stimulus under the conditions that we've been talking about.
Now that you're not in official capacity at CBO, and Dr. Eakin, you as well, do you work some dynamic figures in, such as better trade agreements and perhaps more competitive Fed interest rates, competitive versus the rest of the world? Would that add to GDP in your view?
So I certainly spend a lot of time worrying about the quality of economic policy. And I think, starting with the Fed, that the Fed has done a remarkably good job of exiting from extraordinary monetary policy. I don't think we could have anticipated it would go as well as it did. And that's been an enormous benefit to the U.S. economy. Interest rates in other countries are noticeably lower because those economies are more broken. And I don't want to get lower interest rates from a broken economy. I'd prefer to have a strong economy which would display higher productivity and interest rates. I think that's where we are. In terms of the Tax Act, I think the focus is too much on the individual side and the cut and the stimulus that comes from that, and not enough attention was focused on the bipartisan agreement that the U.S. corporation income tax was broken, was damaging our international competitiveness, was harming our capacity for economic growth, and the most important reforms in there are structural reforms that will last, that are permanent and should improve the incentives to invest, innovate, and have higher productivity in the United States. And those are key parts of policy. We can enhance them even further.
Thank you. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. And I just really want to build off of the last points that were being made, because I come from Nevada, and we were a state that faced really some of the hardest hit circumstances from the Great Recession, and I saw directly the impacts not only to my neighbors and folks in my community, but I was serving in the state legislature at the time, and so had to deal with the impact of losing about a third of our state's economy during that recession. Nevada lost more jobs to our workforce than any other state during that period, with more than 70% of those losses in the greater Las Vegas metro area. So one of the points that was just being made about the Jobs and Tax Cut Act is that while the corporate tax rate was permanent, the middle class tax cuts and tax cuts for small businesses were temporary. And that shows just the inequity in the tax policy that was set by this administration and Republicans in Congress. But today I would like to focus on how we can strengthen the unemployment insurance program as an automatic stabilizer. I'm a member of the Ways and Means Committee as well, which has jurisdiction over the unemployment insurance program, which serves as a lifeline for many Nevada families. And without the unemployment insurance program during the recession, I don't know what many families would have done to keep the living standards that they were able to maintain. Earlier this Congress, Ways and Means, and subsequently the full House passed H.R. 1759, the Bridge for Workers Act, which would ensure that states have flexibility to provide reemployment services to workers receiving earned unemployment benefits who need them. UI is one of the many tools we have at our disposal to help keep people and families afloat when they experience job loss during an economic downturn. Not everyone, though, is eligible for unemployment insurance, such as independent contractors, because they don't pay into the program. That is particularly true today because we have so many workers who make a living off of the informal gig economy. But one of the positive aspects of unemployment insurance is the fact that it functions as a federal-state partnership. So, Dr. Aljawhari, if I said that wrong, I apologize. What options with respect to unemployment insurance can policymakers consider to meet the needs of those who are increasingly working in the gig economy during times of high unemployment?
Thank you for your question, Congressman, and you got the pronunciation correct. Thank you. One of the things you look at is there's a proposal that's been talked about called the Job Seekers Allowance, which would work to kind of fill in the gaps beyond those for unemployment insurance. So as you mentioned, independent contractors, people also who you have to be employed for about a year to be able to get unemployment insurance, and there's people, especially like new labor entrants that are not eligible. And what you would do is you'd come up with kind of a weekly benefit, about $170, which is relates to kind of the low-income people. And so you would expand eligibility, you'd provide this weekly benefit, and then also have the reemployment services, things called RESIA, where you'd help people kind of stay attached to the labor force. And so the key is, as you've talked about, and as actually was mentioned before, is that the context of where we are now in terms of the economy is much different than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so we have to have our programs to adjust for that. And so having a simple program, what's called like the Job Seekers Allowance, where you just get that weekly benefit, provide employment services, would help address that issue.
Thank you. And Mr. Hicks, again, from the state perspective, on what more can be done to help them ensure that they are prepared to respond in a recession. What should states be doing now with their rainy day funds and other tools in order to be ready to utilize those tools when necessary?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. The first thing you mentioned was rainy day funds. The states have been adding to their rainy day funds after the last recession to a level that has never been seen before. And so the lessons were learned from the last two recessions that the sufficiency of their reserves were not there. And so states have been active in this area, raising the caps or their rainy day funds, tying some of the income, the deposit rules to volatility of revenues. A number of states are taking the extra revenue they get from certain volatile taxes and putting those in the reserves rather than budgeting them and increasing their base. The other thing that's happened in the last couple of years particularly is a return to a structural balance. A number of states through the slow recovery had structural imbalances in their budgets. And so more and more governors and legislatures now have budgets that are recurring revenues and equal recurring expenses and paying attention to the non-recurring uses of things. So settled into a lower risk expenditure profile is one of the things they're doing. And then other things they're doing is planning better, stress testing, both their revenue and expenditure growth under various scenarios, a mild recession, a moderate recession, a severe recession, and at least informing the legislature and governors about, well, what would it look like if a downturn occurs, and being a little more knowledgeable ahead of time about doing those things. Those are and some of the things that we did during the Great Recession. We had all kinds of tricks that we needed to do to avoid severe cuts and to balance the budget. We're rolling some of those back into the toolbox and setting ourselves up to, if we had to use those things again, not good budget policy, but sometimes necessary actions that states are preparing in that way.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, thank you for your courtesies. I was in a markup, but this is such an important hearing that I wanted to make sure that I was able to get here. My questions will be in the backdrop of the most deadliest or devastating tax cut that has now generated debt that I don't think we've experienced in the last 3 presidencies. I was here with the presidency of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. I was also here, Dr. Elmendorf, you have to get my numbers straight. I think it was 07, 08 when we got the word from Secretary Paulson that we were not going to be the country that we thought we were in a matter of a weekend. So I want to have it in the backdrop of this $1 trillion plus tax cut, and then a news item that I've heard that we do have unemployment, but hiring has slowed down. And I don't know whether that's an indicator that we should certainly be looking at. But let me then pose these questions first to Dr. Elmendorf. Since I lived through this, what is your assessment of what would have happened without the Recovery Act? If you can just ask these 2 questions, and why are automatic stabilizers fiscally responsible?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Without the Recovery Act, the previous recession would have been longer.
Put the year for me on there so that it'll be in the record.
So you and your colleagues enacted the Recovery Act in 2009, and without that action, the terribly deep recession would have been even deeper, longer, more severe than it was. Automatic stabilizers are important because it is difficult for the Congress to always act very quickly when economies fall into recession. Economists are bad at predicting recessions, but quick responses from fiscal policy are important. And the way to do those quick responses is to build them in ahead of time. Automatic stabilizers in our current fiscal system have arisen by accident, essentially, of having certain sorts of tax provisions and spending programs that were designed to achieve other ends. If we strengthen the automatic stabilizers in a deliberate way, that would then provide stronger anti-recessionary policy when the economy needs it.
Give us an example of one that we could strengthen.
So, for example, Congresswoman, you and your colleagues could enhance the unemployment insurance system in a way that would provide benefits for a longer period of time, which makes sense if you end up in an economy in which jobs are harder to find. You could also write into law increases in federal payments to states for the Medicaid program, which would help governments get through recessions without having to cut other sorts of benefits or raise taxes, which would be exactly the wrong thing to do. You could write into law a cut in the payroll tax of the sort that you and your colleagues enacted to help fight the last recession. But that could be written into law with a trigger to take effect if unemployment rises, and then a trigger to be turned off when unemployment falls back down again. Those are the sorts of policies I have in mind.
I appreciate it. The question is, we should have more than an umbrella on a rainy day. We need to really get prepared. For the last two gentlemen, I'm going to ask my question so that you can be answering it. Let me just indicate to Mr. Hicks, I think some of the questions may have been asked that we are concerned about, but I'd be interested in Kentucky's experience with the Recovery Act. And I'd also be interested in whether you think a recession is inevitable. And let me then pose my question to, which means that we should be getting all of our emergency ducks in order to be prepared, either Boy Scout, Girl Scout, Red Cross, however you'll be prepared, we need to be prepared. Dr. Aljawhari, if I heard you talk about unemployment, but I'm interested in a question, are there steps that we should be taking to make sure that Medicaid, SNAP, and I did think I heard you were talking about unemployment insurance, are ready for the next recession? We get colds and others in impoverished conditions have pneumonia and have to be hospitalized. And I'm really concerned, I just have a unreadiness about this enormous debt because of this tax cut, among other things that we're existing right now. So I've asked first if Mr. Hicks would answer, and then Doctor.
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman.
If you got my questions?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I spent 32 years in the Commonwealth of Kentucky and 25 in the budget office. So the Great Recession was a series of continuous budgeting for states. States typically will cut first as revenues fall short of the estimates. And in fiscal 2008, the recession had already started. We had a brand new governor in transition. The first the first briefing I had with that governor was how much he was going to have to cut spending, for when he was walking in the door. And so, and then we put budgets together for fiscal 2009 before the Recovery Act. So that was done in the 2008 legislative session. Again, we were planning for downturn without any expectation of assistance from the federal government. And so what had happened, states quickly pivoted to try to array that assistance they had across those multiple years. The flexibility that was in the Recovery Act for use of some of those funds was very helpful. States could choose how much to use one of those streams of funding over year A or year B. It was really important to measure that against their drawdown of their reserves, because we had a number of states that did 3 consecutive years of drawdown of reserves, exhibiting kind of a planning of don't empty it out until we know it's really bad. And so states struggled, but I think weathered a lot of those issues. And then the ability or the requirement to maintain spending on education that was part of the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund really assisted states in preventing from significant reductions in our primary spending item, which is K-12. And in terms of inevitability of recessions, they're always inevitable. We just don't know when they are. And so my membership this year has taken up this project to kind of just talk about, like this committee hearing is just what can we do to be ready when? And what were the lessons that we learned from past occurrences? It really is just an educational and informative process to just be thinking ahead, and state budget officials are typically very good planners.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. So we talked a lot about unemployment insurance because that's kind of like the first stage, but other programs like SNAP and Medicaid are very helpful too. And one of the reasons why it's helpful is because when people look for a job, they still have to eat. They still have issues with health care. And so these programs can help with those things that make it easier then to get back to work. And so one of the things we can do is with SNAP, we already have an existing program. One of the things that could happen is they could do a trigger where if there's a downturn, you immediately boost benefits by 15%. So now you give people more money to spend on food and things like that, so they don't have to worry about that, and you're able to hit more people. The other thing you could do is you could also, there's been a big push for work requirements, as if people don't want to work. And even though, a gentleman before had mentioned that, he knew of people like that, there's a lot of people who do want to work. And so adding work requirements that make it difficult, even if you do work requirements, you have to put in the infrastructure. So a lot of times you have, we're moving to automation, and there's a lot of things you have to do online. Now, one, it's difficult for people to learn how to use these things online, but then you have to think about certain areas, like rural areas in rural communities that don't even have broadband. How are they going to, satisfy these work requirements? Or you have work requirements that say, oh, well, you need to apply to 5 jobs a week. But if you're in a rural community with 3 employers, how can you meet those? And so because you have these work requirements and people getting kicked off, Now you're making it even worse for them. So you can remove work requirements, you could boost spending with SNAP, and as the gentleman was talking about, states, sometimes you can't rely on the federal government, but the federal government can do a lot to do that, to help them out. And so excuse me, when there was, lack of spending by the states because they had that balanced budget rules, the federal government had a program where they supplemented them. Now that can be made automatic so that in a downturn, federal government already, automatically provides supplemental funding so that you're not cutting Medicaid, you're not cutting SNAP, you're not cutting CHIP. And so there's a number of things in these other programs that are very helpful, that are very important during a downturn that the federal government can do.
I thank the gentleman.
Thank you.
Gentlewoman's
Yield
time
back.
has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Chakowski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm so sorry that I missed your statements. I wish we wouldn't schedule hearings all at the same time, and I'm such a proud member of this committee, so I'm glad. And if everything I ask has already been talked about, I'm going to apologize up front. But I do want to get an answer to these questions. So who exactly was left behind in the Great Recession and the recovery that followed, and who is still really being left behind, and maybe how we could address that? I'm gonna leave that open to whomever wants to answer that. Doctor?
Congresswoman, in recessions traditionally, and in the last recession, people with less education lose jobs at a higher rate than people with more education and end up with higher unemployment rates. And members of racial and ethnic minority groups, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, tend to, and did in the last recession, end up with higher unemployment rates. So it is the people who have the worst economic experiences in general between recessions also end up having the worst experiences in recessions on average. And you and your colleagues can do more to help these people, both in a regular year and when recessions hit. And what your budget tools, of course, are tax policy that supports working people and spending programs that support people when they can't find jobs. And those programs are particularly important when jobs are harder to find in recessions.
Thank you. Let me ask Dr. Aljawhari. Aljawhari?
Yes.
Okay, say it a little faster. I'll get it. We, in the House of Representatives, voted to raise the minimum wage gradually. And we also, in that same bill, got rid of the tip wage, $2.13 an hour, and went to one fair wage. So isn't raising the minimum wage really important for protecting those people that are vulnerable during recessions and in between recessions?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. It is very important because some of the issues is not just an economic issue, but even almost like a job quality issue. And so a lot of problems with, tip wage, you have a lot of issues of, sexual harassment or other types of harassment that when you have that minimum wage and you get rid of the tip minimum wage, that goes away because you're not working so much for that. The other thing is that it was mentioned earlier that low-income workers have done really well in the last 2 years. A lot of that's coincided with state-level increases in the minimum wage. And so if we had a national minimum wage, a federal minimum wage, that would boost incomes for a lot of low-income workers. And then as it's going to have that stimulus effect to help out. So one of the things is that consumer spending is 70% of GDP, and that's what's been keeping this economy afloat. And so you boost the incomes, especially of low-income people, that's going to help continue this economic growth, and so we don't have to worry about a recession as much. So it's very important to have that.
I want to ask you, though, I'm all for raising the minimum wage and the way that we did it. It gets to $15 an hour by 2025 is what we've done. I'm wondering what you think in terms of what that is that meaningful enough by 2025, or are we going to look at $15 an hour is inadequate by those almost 6 years, or well, 5+ years?
I would say, well, right now, in 2025, as it stands, the minimum wage is going to be $7.25. So if it's $15, that's going to be important. And so I think the key is that we have to worry about, let's try to increase it. And if it turns out by 2022, 2023, we find that maybe it needs to be higher, we can do that. Because we do that with tax cuts. You know, we pass a tax cut, and then 2 years later, we say, oh, well, we need to make it permanent. We can do the same thing with the minimum wage. We can say, okay, let's pass the minimum wage. It's going to be $15 in 2025, but in 2021, if we find it inadequate, then we could pass a bill to boost it up again.
I appreciate that advice, and that we should watch carefully and make sure that we're serious about moving closer to a living wage in our country. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Womack, for 10 minutes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a good discussion today. I appreciate our witnesses today. I said in my opening remarks that, and this is kind of a prayer that I have for our country, that we would spend as much time trying to use lessons learned in history to better protect ourselves against a recession, a potential recession, by preventing it, than we do spending time on how to figure out how to build all of these automatic stabilizers into the formula so that we can guarantee something to happen. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. Here we are in the Budget Committee having and I agree with my colleagues that talk about the need to do a budget, because I do think, as Speaker Pelosi indicated, that it is a statement of your values, and we don't really know what those values are because we didn't do a budget and we didn't lay this out for the American people and have that adult level discussion about it. But here we are today talking about how can we add to more mandatory spending in this country when any person with half a brain and decent in 8th grade math can figure out that when 70% of your federal spending is on the mandatory side of the ledger, and you're going to run $1 trillion deficit, which is going to come really close to equaling the amount of money we're going to spend on the discretionary side of the ledger, a significant portion thereof. Here we are talking about adding to it, when I think the conversation we'd be better spent talking about issues of how do we better prevent a recession from happening through our policy discussions, and get off of this desire or this insatiable appetite to talk about relitigating the 2016 election with impeachments and investigations. I mean, that's consumed the Congress of the United States right now. But yet here in these committee hearings, we're talking about things that actually have the chance to move the needle for the American public. So, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, thanks for indulging me in my soapbox speech. You have already talked about things we could do. I've made a couple of notes here. We could influence some resistance to future recessions through education policy, could we not?
Yes.
How?
I'm, as I mentioned in the answer to another question, I'm deeply concerned, beginning in the K-12 area, that our education system is badly underperforming, and it's not just an economic issue. It's a great social injustice. We're going to create an underclass if we do not educate those individuals better. If you want to find the single biggest indicator that someone is going to get into student debt problems, find someone who comes out of high school and needs remedial help entering college. Those individuals are less likely to graduate. If they do graduate, they're likely to take longer, and they're going to end up with more student debt. So this starts at the beginning, and in the end, what we care about is capacity to participate and productivity of participants in the labor force. That's at the core of it.
Yeah, and let us remind ourselves we have a student loan debt bubble right now of $6 trillion. And my understanding is about $400 billion of that, 25% of the amount, has been accrued to people who never received a college degree. How has that helped us protect ourselves against a future recession?
That's heading the wrong direction, quite frankly. I think the student loan program is something that needs deep review by the Congress.
Dr. Elmendorf, I see your eyes lit up a little bit over there, so I want to give you a chance to comment on the same assertion that I made, that policy discussions, good policy discussions about how to protect ourselves against a future recession. And let me just give you an example of what drives my thinking on it. We know there's going to be another recession, just like we know there's going to be another hurricane. We just don't know where and when. But there are things we can do to protect ourselves against that next future hurricane if we just use our heads a little bit and use some of the lessons learned in history, like raising the base flood elevation or protecting, building from materials that are more wind resistant and that sort of thing. So why could we not do the same thing about recessions?
So I think we can and should, Congressman. So I sympathize very much with Doug's concern about the educational system in this country. And I agree that you and your colleagues should work to build a stronger trend growth of our economy. I think that's a complement to, not a substitute for, also thinking about what will happen when a recession hits. So to use your analogy, we should build buildings out of floodplains, but we still need FEMA to turn up when the hurricanes hit. And what I'm saying here, my view of economic policy fits that. We should build a stronger economy for the medium term and long term. We should also be prepared for the consequences of a recession.
But we already have automatic stabilizers in place. Why are they not sufficient?
So that's an important question, Congressman. I think the answer is that the strength of those stabilizers was not by design by you and your colleagues. You've built tax provisions and spending programs to achieve other ends. And out of those decisions, we end up with a certain amount of automatic stabilization. But it's not by design. We haven't picked the current amount. And if you look at the past recessions we've had in this country, we've had a lot of people lose jobs and not be able to get back to work as quickly as we all would like them to, in ways that I think stronger stabilizers would have helped. And will be even worse going forward, because with market interest rates in the 2% range, not the 5, 6, 7% range of the past, the Federal Reserve will have less room to cut the federal funds rate. So I think we'll need even stronger fiscal policy to fight recessions in the future. But can I just say one more thing, Congressman? It doesn't have to be spending. It can be tax cuts. So I've referred every time these questions have come up, there could be cuts in payroll taxes of the sort that people here did in the Congress a decade ago. So you should not think about it as there are spending ways to do it, and I personally think there are important spending aspects of that. But if you and some of your colleagues prefer to fight recessions with tax-based countercyclical policy, that can have some of the same, not all of the same, but some of the same positive effects that I've been talking about.
In this resiliency discussion that we're having, sometimes I believe we can talk ourselves into believing that we're going to have a recession. And when you turn on the nightly news and all these economists who are like TV weathermen, they still keep their job even though they're wrong. We sometimes say it enough that the average Joe out here believes that it's about to happen. And every metric that I look at, even inverted yield curves, are not long-term in nature. There is no evidence that it's going to happen. And even if and when it does happen, every recession is going to be different than the previous one. The time frames are different, the conditions are different. For example, 1970s, it was about energy. In the early 2000s, it was a dot-com, and then we all know the housing bubble. I believe we're going to have some kind of a hiccup with student loan debt, but that's just me, and we got to figure out a way to fix that. So, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, should we be tailoring automatic stabilizers if, in fact, we don't have a sufficient number? I believe we do, but if we're going to do those, shouldn't we tailor those to the situation rather than just try to do a one-size-fits-all approach?
As I said, I understand the logic, and I think it makes sense, for example, to think hard about whether the real value of unemployment insurance is at the appropriate level, right? It's diminished over time. That's a stabilizer we have, make sure that it's efficient and is working well. What I don't know how to operationalize, like, you would have to write law, and this is the Budget Committee, so magnitudes matter, is what is the trigger? Is it the level of unemployment? Is it the increase in unemployment? How much do you cut the payroll tax if that's the thing that's gonna be triggered? 2 percentage points, 3 percentage points, 5? We don't know what the recession looks like. So how in advance are you going to write down the actual metrics, which are, we're gonna spend this money and this is how much we're gonna spend in an unknown future? So I just don't know how to operationalize this idea. It sounds great, but I don't know how to do it. And I'm not sure anyone has enough science to do it well. And my concern, I'll repeat, is I think it will be impossible for a future Congress in the face of a recession to do nothing. And the idea that you're gonna rely on automatic stabilizers, it's all gonna be good, I think is not realistic. A future Congress is going to do things. And so given that you're going to do discretionary things, don't set yourself up to spend the money twice or cut the taxes twice.
Well, I know I'm about out of time. I don't want the moment to pass, though, without referring to a conversation you had with Mr. Series here about immigration, because, again, here is another policy that the Congress of the United States is, I think, required to address because we have a broken immigration policy. And within the last couple of years, we've had policy on the floor, legislation on the floor that would in fact do exactly what Mr. Series was talking about in terms of visas and this sort of thing, and how we can build a system that provides something that would contribute strongly to the economy if it were done properly. And not lost on me was the fact that he voted against that particular policy when it came on the floor. And I'm sure it was more over political reasons and the political consequences of trying to support something like that rather than one on merit. So, and I'm just going to leave it there. If I got one more moment, since Ms. Jackson Lee took 4 extra minutes, I don't mind taking an extra minute. I never let these moments pass without asking our panelists, because I believe that $22.5 trillion of debt is way too much. And we're going to spend $400+ billion this year on servicing that debt. That $400 billion would pay for a lot of really cool stuff if we had the money with which to do it across the spectrum of discretionary spending. Dr. Elmendorf, when is it time for us to do our jobs?
Every day, Congressman. I think you are right, Congressman, to note that we have a level of debt, and even more importantly, a trajectory of that debt under current policies that is not sustainable. And ultimately, you or your successors will raise taxes and cut benefits and services to reduce the rate of borrowing. But it is also true that we have interest rates today that are lower on Treasury debt than they've been essentially any point in my professional lifetime. They've been trending down for decades, not just in this country, but other countries as well. And there is a signal in that about how much damage the outstanding debt is doing. And with low interest rates, that is a signal that the crowding out of investments is not so costly. Because one of the ways we've always tracked the cost of that crowding out is interest rates get pushed up. Interest rates are very low today. So that makes the problem less urgent. Less urgent than I said when I came here as director of the Congressional Budget Office half a dozen years ago, because we've seen something happen in the world, which is a further decline in interest rates. That doesn't mean we can go on like this indefinitely, but it does mean that it's a less urgent problem.
So maybe less urgent, but urgent nonetheless, right?
It's out of fashion to worry about this. I don't mind being out of fashion. I think that the heavy focus of the economics profession on interest rates has missed the fact that the primary deficit, the mismatch between spending and revenue, is large and growing and needs to be dealt with, and that's the Budget Committee's job.
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, it's indisputable that as a percentage of our economy, discretionary spending, that which the appropriators of the Congress have to deal with and are currently wrangling with, is going down, and that as a percentage of the economy, mandatory spending is continuing to skyrocket. And I would hope that our committee will eventually come to terms with that and be willing to deal with it, no matter how tough the political world may be. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now yield myself 10 minutes or however much time I can take. Yeah. Thanks again to all the witnesses. I think it's been a very useful discussion. I thought it was getting way off the tracks for a time being, not from the witnesses, but from some of the members who wanted to talk about how great things were. And the whole point is to say, whatever you think of the current state of the economy, as the ranking member said, we know the hurricane's coming at some point, and is there something we should be doing now to get ready for it? That's a pretty simple question. I know we don't usually think too far ahead in this body, but it's useful to at least have that discussion. And Mr. Hicks, I'm sorry that I didn't mention your 25 years of service to the Commonwealth of Kentucky, our beloved state, earlier in the hearing. And I thought you were going to get ignored for the whole hearing, so I was prepared to spend most of my time talking to you, but fortunately people did turn attention to you. Getting back to the Recovery Act and Kentucky's experience, I know when we debated the Recovery Act, we on the Democratic side said we want more infrastructure, we want to spend more, and we want more infrastructure, and Republicans said they wanted to spend less, they wanted to get it under $900 billion, and they wanted much of it to go to, a larger share to go to tax cuts than we did. I don't know who was right or wrong, but in the Kentucky experience, what would you, if you were writing it today, and granted that we're different now than we were in 2009 and 10, but if you were to write it today, how would you have done it differently?
As it relates to infrastructure, I think one of the things that departments of transportation across state governments will tell you, they have plenty of projects they can do, resurfacing, bridge repair. The infrastructure deficit has been well documented. There's plenty of that kind of spending that isn't transformative, that isn't reinvestment, but is truly spending. There's more of that supply of projects available than there are on the long-term projects. The construction of a brand new bridge. Well, that is as Mr. Elmendorf said, a longer-term issue. So in one sense, there's plenty of spending that takes place there. States in the last 6 fiscal years, over 33 states have raised their gas taxes. It didn't matter what party the states were, they've done that. And so that is the area of some of the largest spending increase that states have done because they recognize that infrastructure deficit. So that's one area that I think is good. The other superlative I would say is the use of Medicaid as a means of both incorporating the fact that enrollments rise and that safety net element needs attention. Also combined with the fungibility of the dollars that the last 2 recessionary fiscal responses have had is very effective. If you want to get spending done quickly and you want to keep states from raising taxes or really reducing education spending, because that's where most of our big dollars go to, that is a very effective tool and has proved effective in the last 2 recessions. We looked at that very closely, when we were contending with the Great Recession, and it really was a rescue effort aimed at really K-12 spending and higher ed spending at the time. I will say the fiscal cliff that we ran into, we didn't know how long the recession was going to last. And on state revenues, it lasted longer than anyone expected. And so when the relief dropped off, we had to do what we had to do, which is we had to backfill the Medicaid with state dollars, and we cut the heck out of everything else. We tried to keep K-12 spending from being cut, but higher ed took uniformly across the country the biggest single-year spending cut that we've seen in years and years, because that's the largest discretionary element of state government spending. And then the last thing I said in my remarks, this kind of conversation and an institutional type of conversation between and among the federal government, state governments, and the local governments, we used to have done in a better way back when the ACIR, the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, was a kick. So one of the things in terms of your theme here of preparing and getting ready for that next contingency is to pay some attention to that. Speaker Ryan had a task force on that issue a couple of years ago, and I still think it's important because when such a large amount of the Recovery Act flowed through state governments on domestic spending, and I will say, it was a shock in terms of the amount of effort that needed to be done, but we were all willing to do it. And I think states worked really hard. But the federal government did a really good job of communicating during the time of implementation. And GAO did an excellent job in terms of getting out ahead of these things so they could identify problems and get to resolution before enforcement had to take place in later half. So I think some of that preparation are the lessons learned, and I'd love to see some of that institutionalized.
Good. Some of my Republican colleagues were talking about how great the economy is and minimize the risk here. But just for a review of history, Dr. Elmendorf, and by the way, I apologize. I'm not sure I introduced you as the dean of the Harvard Kennedy School at the beginning. I introduced you as a former CBO, but you got to get a shout out to the Kennedy School. But wasn't there growth, the economy growing at a fairly reasonable rate back in 2007, right before it wasn't?
So, Congressman, Mr. Chairman, I'll say first that some of the alumni of the Harvard Kennedy School are here and you're members of your committee. We are very proud of that. Economists are very bad at predicting recessions. In fact, it's quite common for economists, once a recession is known to have started, to look back and see economists, leading policymakers, saying things like, well, we're not in recession now, but it turns out, in fact, the economy had already slowed because the data become available with a lag, and there are jolts that are reversed and then jolts that are not reversed. So it's hard to know, and that's why it's important to be prepared.
With the quarter before we went into a negative growth rate, we had a 2.5% growth rate in GDP. So we're essentially where we are right now. You said something, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, that I think is really important when you talked about the differences between the 90s and today. Some of my colleagues have heard me say this, I repeat it all the time. We had this chief technology officer from Microsoft in my district several months ago, and she said that over the next 10 years, we would experience 250 years worth of change. Even if she's 50% wrong, that's an awful lot of change. Then one of the top people at IBM told me that in the next 3 years alone, artificial intelligence was going to change or significantly change or eliminate 150 million jobs around the world. That's just in the next 3 years. So we are in a period of rapid change, and it's going to get more and more rapid. So I think the idea that we could face, the almost certainty that we will face some really significant disruptive changes in society that are going to make significant difference and without question will disadvantage certain categories of the population, as we know, is something I think makes this discussion much more important. One of the things that you talk about enhancing economic growth and chances that I've become more and more focused on is early childhood education, in that we know that very soon we're going to be a minority, we're going to be a majority non-white population, and which means that a generation or two from now, the tax base is going to be majority non-white. And we have a lot of people in vulnerable situations whose children are going to make up a lion's share of the tax base a generation or two from now. Is that one of those things that you think we could do along with immigration and other things too?
There's a lot of evidence that early childhood education has high returns over the course of people's lives. That's in the economics literature pretty clearly. From the Budget Committee's perspective, I think the key is this is yet another piece of evidence that we have two budget problems. One's the mismatch on revenues and spending, and the other is the composition of the spending. Discretionary accounts are the place where you do all the genuine investments, basic research, infrastructure, education, and the mandatory programs, which are largely legacy programs and aimed at the elderly, are pushing out the discretionary accounts, and the kids get shortchanged as a result. And how you deal with that, I think, is one of the fundamental challenges of the budget going forward.
Thank you for that. And going back to immigration, I don't know, I'll let Mr. Series speak for himself about why he voted against it, but you're not talking about back in 2013, are you? No. Because the reason that a lot of Democrats, and I'm sure I was one of them, voted against that was because it was the easy stuff to do. And one of the problems we've always faced in doing immigration reform, at least since I've been here, is everybody wants to do the easy stuff, H-1B visas, yeah, simple. Border security, yeah, we can do border security. DACA, path to citizenship, those are the tougher things. And I think that's what, as someone who was involved in, I was one of the Gang of Eight in 2013, worked for 7 months to bring comprehensive immigration reform to the floor when the Senate had already passed it, and we weren't able to get it to the floor, even though 7 of the 8 of us had signed off on a proposal that we thought could pass.
The bill I'm talking about did have the 6-year DACA fix in it. So that's the bill I'm
Temporary
talking
DACA
about.
fix, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. But I totally agree that immigration reform, agree with you, the ranking member and everybody else, is something that it's not optional, it's mandatory. In my district, over the last 10 years, 100% of the population growth has been from immigration. None has come from native-born growth. And we had a hearing on immigration and its future impact on the budget, and one of the witnesses said that it's estimated about 2045, 87% of the population growth of the country would be from immigration. So it's something that, again, looking down the road, we definitely have to do. So anyway, once again, thank you all for your testimony. I've found the discussion extremely interesting and valuable. And I don't think I have anything else to do except to say once again, thank you, and thank the ranking member. And without objection, the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.